What if the earth itself had been invited to speak, and men and women of another age learned how to listen? Beneath Malta's pale limestone, they answered that call. Long before names were written, long before harbors glittered with Phoenician sails, a peculiar island people began to rearrange the world beneath their feet. The Hypogeum at Calciflini did not appear by chance. It was the culmination of centuries of thought, geology, and tenacious craft. To understand its birth is to read a dialogue between stone and human will. The soft Globigerina limestone that crowns Malta, the sea that circled the island like a slow metronome, and the steady hands of Neolithic artisans who first set to work sometime in the 4th millennium BCE. Radiocarbon measurements and stratigraphic study pin the Hypogeum's principal phases within the island's long temple period, roughly between 3600 and 2500 BCE, with a crescendo of activity around the 3rd millennium. But dates alone fail to catch the wonder. Here is deliberate descent, a planning of negative space so precise it seems as if the builders had first imagined rooms in reverse. The islanders who undertook this subterranean project were heirs to a megalithic tradition, the same cultural pulse that raised the above-ground temples of Kagontija, Tarxene and Najd. Archaeological sites such as Skorba and the charms of Najdra show that Malta's communities had long been shaping stone, shaping ritual, shaping the map of sacred places. The Hypogeum, however, represents a reversal, where others raised stones to the sky. These builders reached down, carving against gravity to create a place of darkness, shelter, and perhaps revelation. It was not the crude hollowing of a cave, but a planned architecture of absence, cut from bedrock with an intimate knowledge of the island's strata. The limestone here is layered, bands of denser, marl and softer shell-rich beds, and the masons of prehistory exploited these differences, following the rock's grain like a seamstress, following thread-carving vaults and passageways where the stone allowed. How did they cut so precisely without metal? The traces are eloquent, where patterns on surviving carved surfaces, the shapes of tool marks, and the presence of chipped flint and polished stone tools in nearby settlement layers suggest the labor of percussion and abrasion. Antler picks, stone molds, and abrasive sand would have been the palette and brush. Patience, the craft. Work must have progressed in phases, first probing a pocket of natural void or shallow cave, then widening and deepening, leaving intervening pillars and buttresses where the geology demanded support. It is likely that the earliest hollowings owed something to older sacred caves, small hollows of shelter and ritual recorded at even earlier sites like Gard-Lum. The Hypogeum's artisans took that cave impulse and made of it a monumental subterranean plan. The very choice to go below ground carried meaning. Across Neolithic Europe, descent into earth often signified return, transformation, and contact with ancestors or chthonic powers. In Malta, an island with scarce wood and a people heavily dependent on the sea, the earth became a repository of continuity, a cool, stable womb where the past could be both kept and consulted. Stratigraphic layers within and around the Hypogeum reveal not only human handiwork, but a long sequence of use and refinement. Floors relaid, thresholds recut, walls smoothed and adjusted. This was not a one-night project but a communal endeavor, sustained across generations by a social order capable of marshalling labor, ritual knowledge, and the delicate skills of stone carving. The birth of the Hypogeum also tells of connections. Malta's insularity did not mean isolation. Maritime links to Sicily and farther shores brought ideas and craftsmen, but the Hypogeum's uniqueness is unmistakable. A local response to universal human needs, to remember, to shelter, to listen. Later scholars, among them David H. Trump and earlier antiquarians who charted Malta's prehistoric landscape, have argued that such underground sanctuaries are the logical, spiritual counterpoint to the island's open-air temples. Where temples face the sky, some sanctuaries look inward, framing darkness as a medium for the sacred. So the Hypogeum was born not in a single moment but in a succession of decisions, to choose a particular seam of limestone, to begin cutting, to refine the void into rooms that could hold bodies, voices, and rites. Its genesis is as much geological as ceremonial. It is the slow accretion of human attention, the deliberate unmaking of rock to make a place where memory could be kept below the limestone, where the interior of the island became a mind. In that subterranean hush, the first builders of the Hypogeum established a language of depth, whose echoes would haunt the island. later stories and invite every future ear to listen for the slow, speaking stone. They were digging for a cellar, as so many modern awakenings begin, a pick and the promise of brick and breath, when the ground gave way not into earth but into silence. It was 1902, and in Paola, beneath the grey Maltese sky and a patchwork of houses and fields, workmen struck a hollow. A shaft opened to a cool darkness, and a man with a lamp peered into a world that had never felt the wind in 10 millennia. The first explorers climbed down on ropes and ladders, simple men and local curiosity, their lanterns throwing trembling circles on a ceiling that glowed like bone. News raced to Valletta. Antiquarians and officials hurried from the museums and the governor's offices. Chief among them stood Themistocles Zamet, the young Maltese physician turned archaeologist, who would bring the discipline and persistence of science to this subterranean cathedral. Zamet's notebooks, practicable, exacting, would become the first maps of a labyrinth that language had no name for. What emerged in the weeks that followed was less a plundered tomb than an excavation of astonishment. The site revealed tiered chambers hewn entirely from coralline limestone, a complex of stairways and niches, of coffers and silent recesses, a perfect counterpoint to sunlight. Pottery cups, small figurines, and painted stone lay where hands had left them thousands of years before. Most singular was a small terracotta figure later called the Sleeping Lady, a curving, reclined idol whose serene exposure beneath electric lamps would captivate a world thirsty for mystery. When Zamet arranged for the artifacts to be taken to the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta, the public could press its face to glass and see in miniature the faces of the people who had once come down into that dark. The press smelled a story and set it aflame. London papers sent men. Rome and the continental learned societies dispatched telegrams. In cafes and drawing rooms across Europe, the Hypogeum, the underground as print would soon call it, fed imaginaries of priest-kings and oracles. Artists sketched the carved doorways. Photographers coaxed light into the depths with early flash techniques, producing ghostly images of chambers that seemed to breathe. Tourists arrived, not yet volumed by the strict timetables of modern heritage management, and the new public gaze began to trade its warmth for the chill of curiosity. But awakening is never a gentle thing. Early excavation methods, practiced with a zeal for discovery, rather than the restraint later archaeology would demand, did their best and worst. Layers were exposed and interpreted in hurried hands. In the first enthusiasm, some bones were moved, some pigment disturbed, and fragile surfaces were subjected to lamps and breath. Even as Zamet wrote careful inventories and argued for scientific care, the world of 1902 lacked the modern vocabulary of microenvironments, humidity control, and stratigraphic patience. The great rock-cut chambers that had lain undisturbed for millennia were now cared for like guests in a hotel that did not yet understand its plumbing. That tension between revelation and protection would shape the Hypogeum's place in modern Malta. The authorities closed off parts of the site to prevent further casual intrusion, and the state began amassing a public collection. Local pride swelled. Here, beneath the limestone, was proof that Malta's antiquity was not an imported story but anchored in the island's very bed. Scholars debated what the subterranean rooms had meant: tombs, sanctuaries, places of initiation. The questions multiplied faster than the answers, and each new theory was shaded by the romance of discovery. Even more important than the objects removed was the Hypogeum's effect upon archaeology itself on the island. The event in 1902 became a pivot, the point at which Malta's prehistoric monuments ceased to be curiosities for antiquarian cabinets and began to be the subjects of sustained scientific study. Zamet and his contemporaries founded a language of catalogues and plans. Later generations, learning from the imprecisions of that first season, would return with trowels, sieves, and microscopes to read the microstrata of ancient lives. So the Hypogeum awoke twice. First, when pick met void and a passage into the dark revealed an ancient human order, and again when scholarship and stewardship took responsibility for that revelation. The sleeping chambers beneath Paola would from that moment onward be both treasure and trial, a source of national wonder, an object of intense scholarly scrutiny, and the beginning of an uneasy guardianship. The shaft cut in 1902 had opened a passage in time. What descended through it were not just bones and pottery, but the heavy duty of remembering well. Listen to stone that remembers its making. Beneath the battered light of the Maltese sun, the Hypogeum holds a voice not of wind nor rain, but of shape and shadow. A voice that modern ears with their clinical microphones and spectral analyzers have only begun to translate. Its chambers, hewn from Globigerina, limestone 3 to 4 millennia ago, are not mute graves. They are instruments carved at human scale with cavities, niches, and passages that catch and fold sound into something uncanny. Low resonant tones that linger like breath. When the first systematic excavations began under the watchful eye of Themistocles Temi, Zamet in the early 20th century, the records focused on bones, pottery, and painted oak jars. Zamet drew plans, catalogued finds, and stewarded the site into public knowledge. His maps would later serve acoustic researchers as a skeleton on which to hang sound. It was in late 20th and early 21st century laboratories, on the benches of the University of Malta, and in international collaborations, that the Hypogeum's acoustic signature was finally brought into light. Engineers and archaeologists carried speaker arrays and omnidirectional microphones down the stairways and into the dim, listening for what the stones would say. What they found was not random echo, but a disciplined architecture of frequencies. Short impulse tests, hand claps, balloon pops, revealed long reverberation in certain chambers, but it was sustained low tones and vocalizations that produced the most astonishing effects. A singer's hum at particular pitches inflated into a fullness never anticipated by the throat alone. Notes between the lower registers of the human male voice and sub-bass territory were amplified, concentrating energy in the so-called oracle chamber and the connected main chamber. Standing waves formed predictable nodes. Niches acted like resonant cavities, amplifying some harmonics while swallowing others. In practical terms, a deep fundamental could send vibrations through the ribs and skulls of those standing within. A bodily communication as much as an auditory one. Acousticians documented that these resonances tended to be in the low-frequency bands that modern psychoacoustics links to visceral, sometimes physiological responses. Low-frequency sound can interact with the vestibular system and provoke feelings of awe, disorientation, or the uncanny chills that ancient witnesses may have described as divine presence. Vocal droning at specific pitches could have induced a shared altered state, synchronizing heartbeats and calming breath among a gathered group, a social glue as potent as any oath. But was this property accidental? The stones themselves give contradictory testimony. On one hand, megalithic craftsmanship in Malta demonstrates deliberate shaping, belling, carefully smoothed chambers, and precise passage alignments that show an intimate control over form. On the other, the Hypogeum's resonant properties emerge from a complex interplay of volume, shape, and stone porosity, variables that can be exploited by a practiced hand. Some scholars propose a conscious acoustic design, a proto-architectural science in which ritualists knew that certain hollows and niches would magnify the human voice. Others argue for a contingency explanation. Skilled carvers, concerned with space and burial needs, inadvertently created the perfect acoustic environment. Comparative echoes deepen the mystery. Across the sea, at Newgrange and other European passage graves, researchers have also recorded low-frequency phenomena. Above ground, megalithic temples on Malta and Gozo show evidence of deliberate sound-making features. Blind niches, stone basins, and doorways that modulate reverberation. The Hypogeum, however, is unique in its depth and intimacy. Here the air is stiller, the contact between living flesh and carved stone closer, and the resulting sonic effects more intimate and potentially more transformative. Archaeology cannot yet prove the ritual words that were spoken or the songs that once vibrated in those chambers, but it can map a vocabulary of acoustics. Archaeomusicologists and ethnographies suggest scenarios, healers modulating tone to soothe fevered patients, initiates submerged in a cocoon of sound as their new identity was bound to bone, priests amplifying their voice so the unseen dead might be addressed. Whatever the practice, the stone does not merely hold the dead, it sustains the living practice of listening, so the Hypogeum's heart remains resonant and unresolved. Instruments measure its frequencies, engineers model its nodes, and historians debate intent and meaning. Yet when one steps below and sings even a low, tentative note, the past answers not with words, but with a vibration that feels like memory. Stone, human, and sound conspire in a chorus without witnesses. An acoustic enigma that continues to stir our bones and our imagination. Beneath the white glare of Maltese sun, where limestone wears a skin of lichen and memory, the dead keep a quieter counsel. The carved corridors of the Hypogeum are not merely hollows. They are a language of bones, a palimpsest of lives laid down and rearranged with deliberate hands. Here, in the cool underground, the living composed their dead into stories, not as single graves, but as a chorus of remains, a communal ossuary that refuses to be simple. When modern spades first forced air into those dark galleries, archaeologists found not individual tombs with neat inhumations, but a cathedral of commingled skeletons, bones stacked on shelves arranged in niches placed in pits, and at times deliberately grouped on the floor. The deposits accumulated over generations: infants, children, elders, the broken-boned laborer beside the one with healed fractures from a long-ago fall. Estimates speak of thousands of bone fragments. The careful scholars who later examined the Hypogeum speak in cautious ranges, suggesting the remains of many hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 distinct individuals. These bones are not a single moment, but an anthology. The pattern makes one truth plain: this was collective ritual, not mere disposal. The bodies were often allowed to decompose elsewhere. Then their skeletal remains were selected and brought into the chambers, a practice archaeologists call secondary burial. The signs are subtle but insistent: disarticulated bones, cut marks on marrow-bearing long bones, and an absence of inhumation postures that would indicate burial at the moment of death. What that selection meant is the riddle. Were certain bones kept as relics? Were skulls favored for display or veneration? Some niches contain crania placed with care, as if faces were still needed in the dark. Osteological study reveals lives etched into enamel and cortical bone. High infant mortality marks the assemblage, a sorrow shared across Neolithic Europe. But here the survivors bear other signatures: enamel hyperplasia, hinting at childhood stress; osteoarthritis in those pushed into heavy labor; healed fractures that tell of resilience. Yet alongside this human workaday detail lies the extraordinary: traces of deliberate modification and arrangement that suggest ritual choreography. Bones stained with ochre, fragments deposited with small objects, and the spatial ordering of skeletal elements all coax the Hypogeum's designers into the realm of ceremony as much as memory. The layering of depositions is another whispered secret. Some chambers received repeated use over centuries. Older bones were shifted to make room for new ones, then reshelved in a world without paper. This was a literal rewriting of ancestry, the living pruning and curating the dead until the subterranean archive suited the needs of the present. Such activity implies continuity: priests or custodians who guarded not only the rites but the records embedded in bone. Scientific interrogation has deepened the mystery without erasing it. Radiocarbon dates taken from human bone hint at prolonged use across the later Neolithic, while microscopic examination of cut marks and weathering patterns supports the hypothesis of deliberate defleshing and manipulation. Yet the precise meanings, whether the selection of skulls connotes ancestor veneration, social status, or a belief in the skull as vessel of identity, remain debated. Scholars from Temi Zammit in the early 20th century to later analysts such as David H. Trump have argued, each bringing new methods, that the bone deposits were as much liturgy as interment. The Hypogeum's bones also speak of relationship. Infants are not segregated to distant corners. They lie interleaved with adults. Some rows reveal commingled groups that could be family units or ritual cohorts. In one recess, the careful placement of long bones suggests deliberate aesthetic choice rather than accidental tumble. The dead arranged in patterns that the living could read like a hymn. And yet, for all the forensic detail, the chambers preserve an enigma. Why this subterranean concentration? Why gather bones into communal heaps rather than mark individuals? The answers are partial: practicalities of space and the reverence of ancestral remains. Community identity memorialized below ground. But the Hypogeum resists final explanation. Its bone deposits are both archive and altar, a place where anatomy becomes argument, where each rib and molar contributes to an ongoing human negotiation with mortality. Listen closely in those chambers, and you can almost hear a voice rising, not one of the dead alone, but of a people shaping themselves through the stewardship of their dead. In the silence between stacked femurs and careful niches, the Hypogeum offers a lesson older than names: that to bury is also to remember. to build a collective past from the fragments of a fragile present. Beneath Malta's sun-bleached fields, the rock has been made to breathe in human hands, cut, hollowed, coaxed into rooms that are not merely voids but careful thoughts carved into stone. The Hypogeum's architecture is a language of incisions and thresholds, a grammar of stairs and chambers that speaks of people who measured depth not only by feet but by ritual intention. Carved into soft Globigerina limestone, the hypogeal complex unfolds in 3 distinct strata, each stratum a chapter of construction and reuse. The entrance gives way to descending flights, not the ceremonial ramps of above-ground temples, but tight, intimate stairways, hewn with deliberate irregularity. The risers change in height, as if answering the hand that carved them, each step a fingerprint of a builder working generation after generation. These staircases are not mere connectors, they are controlled transitions, forcing the body to slow, to stoop, to submit to the weight of descent. The middle level is the corridor of thresholds, a procession of low doorways, square-lipped niches, and bench-like ledges, their surfaces smoothed by the tools and by touch. Archaeologists led by Themistocles Temizamet in the first excavations recorded these benches and platforms with careful sketches. Later conservators would note the same wear patterns, elbows, shoulders, hands, as if the living had come to rest here long before the stone accepted its role as tomb. The walls bear faint traces of decoration, horizontal bands where paint once clung, and smudges of red ochre framing entrances, signals of color in a place now subdued to beige and shadow. Deeper still, the lower level is more intimate and more complex, a labyrinth of chambers that curve into one another with a mason's cunning. Doors are deliberately narrow. Some chambers broaden into circular rooms, others fold into long, low galleries. The corners are rounded in places, the joins so seamless that light slips away. In others the tool marks remain, the rhythmic scars of pick and adze frozen in time. These differences are not accident but palimpsest. Successive hands recut, expand, and repurpose spaces, building an architectural biography readable to those who study the stone. Among these carved sanctuaries, one small recess has seized the imagination of every visitor since its dusty discovery at the start of the 20th century, the so-called sleeping chamber. Reclining within its niche was the famous Sleeping Lady, a compact clay figurine, uncovered by Zamet's team, a plastic tranquil image of repose that seemed to answer the chamber's shape. The chamber itself is womb-like, le-roofed, gently curved, with a carved platform that invites the body to lie down. It is not large, but it is scaled to human proportions, its walls enclosing the sleeper as if to mimic a mother's arms. The figurine's discovery there was not merely a tidbit of antiquarian romance. It confirmed that some rooms were designed for presence, for enacted gestures performed in bodily relation to the stone. Architectural ingenuity shows elsewhere in subtler measures. Small oval niches recur, precisely formed and repeated, their depths and placements betraying a standard of practice across rooms. Vertical slots and grooves, now empty, once held perishable fittings, wooden lintels, woven screens, perhaps ritual lamps that have long since vanished. Doorways often present a change in floor level, a drop or rise that enforces a bodily awareness as one crosses from one sacred zone to another. In several places builders left small intentional ledges carved into the walls, not purely structural. These ledges are too carefully placed to be accidental. They were sites for objects for the faithful to touch, or for the substances of ritual to be laid out. The micromorphology of the stone tells a story of technique and time. Tool marks vary in breadth and depth, gouges made by flint or stone picks, smoothing from abrasive sand, reworking that speaks of correction and adaptation. Archaeologists have noted differences in finishing that indicate phases of alteration, rooms expanded, doorways relocated, niches recut, a living architecture that accommodated new rituals, new social needs. Yet the greatest revelation of these subterranean geometries is their choreography of movement. The Hypogeum is not a random graveyard of pits, it is a staged sequence. The stairs set a pace, the thresholds demand posture, the benches command pause. Within the sleeping chamber and its neighboring rooms, the stone enacts invitation and prohibition. It frames the body, prescribes posture, and by its very compression teaches reverence. Conservators today, the custodians of Malta's subterranean memory under Heritage Malta and international teams, walk those same steps with scanning equipment and gloves. reading layers of soot and pigment where the ancients left their marks. They map every ledge and seam, hoping to preserve a language carved into stone. But the stone keeps its secrets in the way only old rock can, by holding human marks and returning them as an architecture of silence, where every stair and chamber is a sentence in a story only partly told. They called it silence, but the silence in those carved rooms was full of marks. Not merely the slow crumble of stone, but the vocabulary of a vanished people pressed into clay, bone, and dust. When the first lamps blinked into the Hypogeum's low corridors, the light fell on red like dried blood, bands on shards, smears on crania, specks in the joints of carved lips. The red ochre there is no mere pigment. It is the remnant of ritual touch, a material sentence left in the margin of death. Red ochre, iron oxide, the earth's own rust, is a small chemistry with enormous meaning. In calciflini, its traces stain bones recovered from the so-called collective deposits, dusted across skulls and vertebrae, layered in the fill between chamber thresholds. Themistocles Temizamet, the early Maltese archaeologist, who first catalogued many of the Hypogeum's offerings after 1902, noted its ubiquity and insisted it could not be accidental. Later scholars, from David H. Trump to Anthony Bonanno, have agreed. Ochre was a deliberate medium, a pigment of memory. It hid in hair and on cloth, brightened incisions, painted the mouth of the dead. Wherever the red clings, you can almost hear hands smearing, sealing, and naming. Alongside ochre, the chambers yielded figures, not portraits but icons of an idea. The familiar corpulent figurines, the so-called fat ladies of Neolithic Malta, appear in shards and whole in the Hypogeum's assemblage. Stylized torsos with heavy hips and pronounced breasts, limbs reduced to suggestion. But the most haunting idol is the sleeping lady, a reclining terracotta form found in a deep niche. Unlike the upright fertility types found elsewhere on the islands, she lies with an almost domestic repose, chin tucked into an arm. In the Museum of Archaeology in Valletta, she watches the visitor as if still tasked with some ancient warding. Was she a goddess of sleep, a funerary guardian, a miniature, autar? We cannot say, only feel the deliberate placement, the care of clay fingers that modeled her. Material choices matter. Many statuettes are coarse terracotta, others are of softer stone, bone, or alabaster. Shell and ivory beads accompany them, strung like punctuation on a string. Tools, flint blades, polished stone celts, are sometimes deposited with no practical use in death. The dead carried their implements and their small gods into the dark, as though continuity of possession mattered as much as continuity of breath. But the most arresting whisper is found not in whole objects, but in the scratches in sized pottery. Shallow lines run with a sharp implement across rims and flanks, hatchings and chevrons, spirals and tight parallel grooves. These marks repeat in motifs across pottery types recovered from the Hypogeum and from contemporary surface temples of Tarxene and Cogentija, suggesting an idiom shared across the islands in the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE. Some incisions seem decorative, the work of an artisan's hand. Others are rhythmic and geometric, their repetitions hinting at a system, a script without phonetics, a memory system encoded in pattern and placement. Scholars have dared to call this a lost language. It is a seductive phrase, because the incisions exhibit constraints. Particular marks favor vessel rims, others cluster around the neck or base. Certain combinations accompany ochre application or are found near figurines. A few pecked symbols repeat with such frequency that the suggestion of semantics, owner's mark, ritual formula, clan sign, becomes hard to resist. Yet the Hypogeum refuses to be read directly. No bilingual text smiles up from the dust. The signs sit like notes without a harmony, urging but denying comprehension. Recent analyses, using microscopy and residue testing, have added texture to the tale. Traces of organic binding agents hint that pigments mixed with fat or resin were applied to both pottery and bone, where patterns on figurines imply they were handled, not merely interred. The little beadwork and drilled shell pendants suggest exchange networks, raw materials from distant coasts, the movement of craftsmen, the circulation of motifs. What binds red ochre idols and incised pottery into a single syntax is attention. The meticulous care of things placed where they could be seen by only a few, the repetition of forms that must have been meaningful to the living and the dead alike. Each artifact is a syllable. Each arrangement, in its silence, is a sentence we can almost feel on the tongue. So we trace the scratches, lift the clay idols in memory, let the red stain the palms of our imagination, and in that act of reconstruction we keep listening for a language that will not quite say its name. They carved it as if to hold a single sound. Descending into the cool belly of the Hypogeum, one finds a chamber unlike the rest, a womb-like cavity hewn from golden Globigerina limestone. Its ceiling low and rounded, its walls smoothed to receive not only hands but voices. This inner room long whispered among excavators as the place where questions were posed to whatever lived beneath the earth has, a presence that is at once architectural and theatrical. It collects light and swallows it. It collects sound and returns it, multiplied, altered, alive. When archaeologists under the direction of Themistocles Zammit cleared the rubble and soot of early 20th century intrusion, they exposed blackened bands on the ceiling, looped traces of oil lamps used again and again. Nearby lay the sleeping figurine, now known as the Sleeping Lady. Fragments of carved stone and shell that suggested offerings. Such small tokens, combined with the chamber's plan, told a story of ritual use, not merely of burial. But it was the chamber's voice that would transform speculation into veritable astonishment. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, acousticians from the University of Malta and visiting European teams took modern instruments into that cramped, echoing space. They sang, they struck tuning forks, they measured decay times and resonant frequencies. The results were uncanny. A sustained low note around the pitch of a deep male hum filled the room and was amplified in a way far beyond what the stone size would predict. Notes that would fade in an ordinary stone chamber instead bloomed and lingered, whole harmonics ringing long after the source had silenced. The so-called oracle responded not with words but with physics, standing waves, focused pressure nodes, and a resonance that emphasized the human voice's fundamental tone. Such acoustics are not merely curiosities. In a society that lacked written alphabets, yet mastered stone, sound would have been a medium as deliberate as paint or clay. Imagine a priest or priestess, seated in the dim, their face lit by a single bowl lamp, voice sliding into the chamber's favored register, each vowel swelling like a tide, each whisper gathering weight. In that orally charged dark utterances could appear to originate from everywhere and nowhere, a spoken presence that the congregation felt at the bones. The Hypogeum's geometry, curved ceilings, carefully placed niches and depressions behaves like an instrument builder's secret, concentrating sound into a sweet spot where auditory perception and bodily vibration meet. Archaeological traces bolster the ritual hypothesis. Votive deposits from the site and nearby temple complexes, Tarxin, Najdra, Kagonta Jerivial, a culture fluent in symbolism, figurines that suggest fertility and authority, ochre smeared in ritual patterns, and burnt residues that attest to controlled smoke and light. In the Hypogeum itself, soot patterns and charred lamp fragments indicate the angles of illumination that might have turned a face into a flickering oracle. Scholars have suggested the interplay of light and shadow was as crucial as acoustics. A shaft of light trained on a seated figure, a sudden extinguishing of flame, a voice that blooms into the dark together, producing an experience that could be called revelation. What the oracle revealed, we cannot say. Some bones, moved and arranged in collective deposits, elsewhere in the complex, intimate, a society, intimate with death. Divination in such a context may have governed passage, fertility, or the recovery of a missing person. Others propose more political readings, pronouncements that legitimated an elite oratory used to bind communities in moments of crisis. The truth is braided with the stones, ritual, authority, and the human hunger to translate the tremor of the world into meaning. Even today, listening to recordings made in that chamber, one senses the past, pressing through a filter of physics. Modern listeners report a disorienting warmth in the chest, a sense that the voice is as much felt as heard. Neurologists and acousticians caution against mystical leaps, yet the power of an environment to shape perception is not a mystery. The brain's rhythms are susceptible to repetition, to bass tones, and to reverberant feedback. In the Hypogeum, technology merely proved what the builders had known by intuitions: how can shape belief. The oracle's final secrecy endures because the rites left no script. We patch the silence with experiments, with careful excavation, with speculative empathy. The chamber holds its secret geometry's curves that make the voice human and the human voice uncanny. We can map the physics and catalogue the finds, and still, walking away from that low-ceilinged dark. One carries a residue of the unknown, the sense that for a people who carved their cosmos in stone, the most potent altar was not a statue, but a sustained, a resonant human sound that reached into the ear and the bone, and suggested insistently that some answers live only where light is thin and sound becomes oracle. The corridor breathed like a throat. Those who passed its carved lip did not simply descend. They crossed an idea made of stone. Mothers led trembling adolescents by the hand. Elders, their faces painted with red dust, carried tokens, beads of bone and shell, tiny carnelian pebbles, and slivers of worked serpentine offered to a presence that had no single name. What survives in the dim is both bone and suggestion, the layered deposits, the careful placement of objects, the staining of plaster with ochre that still smells of ritual to the careful eye. From these fragments, a ceremony can be imagined, not as a single scripted play, but as an evolving choreography of initiation and passage. Archaeologists such as Sir Themistocles Zammit recorded the Hypogeum bone assemblage as remarkably intimate, thousands of elements, representing hundreds of individuals, deposited over centuries. Osteologists have since noted that the interments include juveniles whose graves are sometimes differentiated by accompanying objects, suggesting rites tied to age and status. The evidence speaks of repeated visits, of a community that returned, generation after generation, to enact thresholds here. The deepest chambers were not merely repositories for the dead. They were stages where the living were remade. The rite began with separation. Outside, on terrace shrines like those at Kagunti and Tarxene, offerings were made. Inside, the candidate passed a liminal seam of light and shadow. The Hypogeum's plastered surfaces and painted recesses of ochre and soot still clinging to niches mark points where hands paused. A small carved idol, a string of perforated shells, a disc of red ochre. Each object bore a role, a script. Some finds miniature cups and pins are comparable to those recovered from contemporary temple complexes, hinting at a shared symbolic economy of the late Neolithic Mediterranean, around 3600 to 2500 BCE. Once within, the initiate underwent a sequence scholars now read through stratigraphy and careful mapping of deposits. There are clusters of bones that show marks consistent with manipulation, secondary burial practices rather than casual scattering. Skulls, when found apart from long bones, suggest a reverence for the head as a repository of identity. Ochre smearing on crania, recorded in early excavation notes, would have glazed this focus with color and meaning. A youth's separated skull might have been held, spoken to, or anointed, acts of remembering that doubled as instruction in lineage and secrecy. Sound must have been a principal tutor. While Chapter 4 explores acoustics in technical detail, the ritual implications are plain here. Initiation demanded not only darkness, but modulation, voices low and phased, clapping, and the vibration of bone flutes or shells. Ethnographies would call it a sonic call, a cultivated auditory womb in which boundaries of self blurred. In some recesses, archaeologists recovered thin deposits of soot and microscopic residues of organic compounds, evidence that smoke and scented oils swirled about the initiate, their olfactory memory bound to the low-frequency pulse that the rooms amplified. This was pedagogy through sensation, to learn by echo, hierarchy threaded through the rite. Not every child passed to the innermost chamber. Osteological patterns and grave goods suggest an inner circle, those marked by lineage. Perhaps the priestly families who administered rites tied to agricultural calendars and the island's fertility cults. The notion of an apprenticeship appears in both artifact distribution and wear patterns on ritual tools, repeated handling of small tongs, the polishing of beads, the smoothing of plaster niches, actions that speak of apprenticeship and guardianship. The candidate might emerge with a token, private and small, that certified belonging. The larger community would know this by subtle signs in hairstyle, pigment, or ornamentation. There was also the final teaching, how to die and how to live with death. The Hypogeum's practices blurred the boundary between coming of age and preparatory passage. Some adolescents were interred within few years of their initiation, whether by accident, illness, or the vicissitudes of prehistoric life, and their burial rites recorded the speed and depth of the community's care. Others lived into old age and returned to the chambers to place offerings at the niches associated with their initiation. This created a looping archive of memory, an oral history cast in stone and bone. We cannot reconstruct the precise words the elders spoke. Literacy was not their instrument, but the artifacts, beads, ochre, shell, and carved stone are a vocabulary. They tell of a people for whom adolescence was a ritual rebirth, for whom sound and scent were teachers, and for whom the underground was a catechism. In those chambers the youth were taught to carry the island's past as a weight and a gift, to remember the ancestors whose skulls had been anointed to hear the low-shaping drone that tuned them to a community's tempo, and to accept that identity is both given and earned beneath the limestone. The Hypogeum keeps these lessons in its bones, half understood, half heard, inviting each new generation to listen and wonder. They came down not simply to bury, but to listen. Beneath the honeyed limestone, in a lattice of carved rooms and narrow stairs, the people of the Neolithic island tended a ritual medicine that worked at the edges of sound and scent. The archaeologists who pried the silence open in 1902, Sir Temi Zamet among them, pulled from the earth not only bones and pottery but the fingerprints of practices, powdered ochre on stone ledges, beads placed as if to steady a hand, and the telltale scatter of disarticulated skeletons that hinted at a long repeated choreography of death, care, and return. The Hypogeum's burials were not simple interments. In its deepest reaches, archaeologists found thousands of bone fragments. Estimates at times suggest remains numbering in the many hundreds or even a few thousand. Individuals laid down in patterns that make no sense unless seen as stages. Bodies, it appears, were often exposed or excarnated. Then later their bones collected, cleaned, and deposited anew. This secondary burial is the quiet signature of a culture that attended the dead across time. Grief was not a single plummet but a series of care ceremonies, a looping of remembrance. Evidence from the cut marks and wear on certain bones implies careful handling rather than violence. Skulls bear traces of ochre, a pigment of blood and earth, smeared in ritual paint that stained not only the deceased but the living who touched them. Red ochre seen on bones and in pockets of soil reappears across the Mediterranean as a funeral choreographer's favorite, used to mark passage and metamorphosis. In the Hypogeum, the ochre was both symbolic and practical, a preservative and a seal, a color that spoke of life flowing back into stone. Ancient hands brought more than pigment. The air, as scholars now reconstruct it, would have been a compound of pine resin, heated fats, crushed herbs, and beeswax. Modern residue analysis, careful, cautious tests of potsherds and wall encrustations, has revealed organic traces consistent with plant oils and aromatic resins. Imagine the slow anointing of a forehead with bitter olive oil, the soft application of a balm scented with myrtle or thyme, the protective smear of bitumen or wax along brow and jaw. These substances soothed putrefaction, masked decay, and, just as importantly, reached into belief. They were tangible assurances that the body remained tended. To the living, the Hypogeum was also a theatre of sound. Though acoustic wonders are treated elsewhere in this tale, they bear here a practical, intimate purpose. Low-frequency vocal drones, and the controlled strike of stone bowls intonations in the region of what modern scientists sometimes report as around 10120 J would have made the chambers themselves vibrate. Researchers and experimental musicians who have sung into its hollows felt a creeping warmth, an ache behind the teeth. Listeners describe a subtle slowing of breath, a muted hush of the mind. Such frequencies, now known to affect human physiology, could have been harnessed as a balm of the air, sound used to soothe fever, steady grief, or guide the spirit. This was not mere entertainment. The rites combined tactile anointment with auditory modulation. A mourner might cradle a skull, press soft wax into the ears, anoint the temple, and sing a low lament that turned the limestone into a sympathetic body. In some recesses the bones were rearranged around living patients, who sought to borrow ancestral stillness through proximity and tuned vibration. The line between healing and mourning blurred. The same gestures that eased bereavement touch sent chant also treated coughs, fevered bodies, and troubled minds. The interplay of practical care and symbolic theatre is attested in the objects found. Small stone cups, stained with organic compound residue, tiny trays for mixing ointments, and miniature figurines that might have been held as talismans during rites. Even the famed clay figure known as the Sleeping Lady, unearthed in the Hypogeum, can be read as a talismanic focal point for those who came to mend a body or a soul, her repose an emblem to be mirrored in the patient's stillness. and yet questions not the certainty. Were these bombs inherited domestic remedies elevated into sacred use, or were they specially concocted by an inner circle of caregivers, priest-healers, whose knowledge of plants and the underground's moods was jealously guarded? Did the sound rituals originate as spontaneous wails that became refined technique, or were they the deliberate invention of ritual specialists who tuned chamber and voice like an instrument? We can map traces, ochre-stained palms, oil-slicked sherds, piled bones, and the acoustic signature of vaulted stone. We can also hear, if we listen with a conjectural ear, the murmur of those who descended to tend the dying as one tends a fevered hearth. In the Hypogeum, mourning was never purely private nor healing purely clinical. It was an art of communal choreography, an archaeology of care written in pigment, scent, and resonance, and in every careful placement of bone, the living kept conversation with the absent. The silence left behind is not empty. It throbs with habitual ministrations we are only beginning to understand. Beneath the limestone weathered by salt and sun there grew, in the pale dawn of Maltese time, a conviction carved in rock, that there are gods who dwell below and gods who ride the sky. The builders of the Hypogeum did not invent these tiers of power so much as they made them visible, stacking earth and belief, setting the living against the dead, and fashioning a central presence that gathered their faith like a magnet draws filings. We know the face of that presence in fragments, a small red-stained limestone figurine curled in a sleep that is not merely rest but an emblem of return. The so-called sleeping lady, now silent in the National Museum, is not anonymous. Her posture repeats across the archipelago, and beyond seated mothers, at Tarxene corpulent figures, at Kagontaja, on Gozo, tiny folded-arm idols, from the Cycladesian idiom of being that archaeologist. Sir Temi Zammit, first called to light, and which later scholars from David Trump to Marija Gimbutas read as signatures of a pervasive maternal cult. Whether goddess, ancestor, or royal icon, she embodies an idea. The earth receives and regenerates. But the Hypogeum's god was not a lone mother on a throne. The underground's architecture of the concentric galleries, the hollowed sleeping chamber, niches and recessed platforms speaks of a deity who is both womb and tomb, an axis linking fertility and finality. Bones mingled with votive pottery and traces of red ochre, and the collective burial practice suggests a theology in which the dead were not dispersed, but gathered into a sacred brood. The central deity, if we may name her, so presided over this assembly. She was the keeper of thresholds, the mediator who allowed the living to petition and the dead to be reborn into memory. Across the Mediterranean, contemporaries and later heirs cultivated mirrors to this belief. At Kogar, Kim and Najdra, stone faces of megalithic altars and precise solar alignments declare an opposite locution, gods who command light and seasonal return. At Najdra's lower temple, the sunrise at equinox cleaves a passage through stone. The sun god's voice is made visible, a ritual calendar etched in shadow. The Hypogeum's central deity answers in a language of dark resonance, underworld complement to the sky's sovereign, this polarity chthonic mother below. Celestial power above would echo through millennia, in the descent of Inanna to the Mesopotamian netherworld. In Persephone's seasonal shift in the later Greek imagination, in Anatolia's Cybele, whose wild rites straddled mountain and plain. Trade and traveling ideas braided these islands into a wider tapestry, the folding arms and abstract breasts of Neolithic Cyprus, the seated figures at Ketl-Yak, the later Minoan goddesses with snakes and raised hands etch, offers a motif that finds a remote cousin in Maltese stone. Yet Maltese devotion kept its own tempo. Here, the central figure's cult seems less about singular rulership, and more about corporate fate, lineage, community, and the soil that both feeds and receives them. Inscriptions are absent. Instead, there are gestures, red ochre like sacramental blood, repeated iconography, the placement of figurines in niches like names on an altar. Interpretations have diverged. Gimbutas and her adherents see a pan-European mother goddess whose worship was widespread and whose symbols survived in the Hypogeum. Other voices caution. The evidence is fragmentary, and metaphor is seductive. The truth, perhaps, is more subtle. The central deity of Malta may have been a composital local ancestor deity gathered up and amplified by contact with sailors, traders, and newcomers from Sicily and beyond. She would have been imagined as a being of depth, both sheltering mother and stern custodian of the dead. Those who entered the Hypogeum likely addressed her in more than words, Offerings, song, the measured placement of bodhisol were languages of petition. Above, the temple platforms tracked the sun's arc and regulated harvests. Below, the central deity kept counsel with mortality, promising cyclical return where agriculture promised seasonal return. Together, sky and underworld formed a pantheon, not as a roster of separate beings, but as a paired cosmology, one that reconciled abundance with absence, day with night, the visible with the remembered. Thus the islanders knelt between two heavens. One promised light and the turn of the year. The other kept the house of bones, the deep repository of names. The Hypogeum's central presence sat at their juncture, a deity, both of the earth and of the community that tended it. A quiet sovereign whose legacy is not carved in scrolls, but in the patient pattern of stone and silence that still draws us down, inviting questions we are only beginning to hear. They who governed the dark knew how to make silence into law. Beneath the limestone skin of Malta, the Hypogeum kept not only bone and pottery, but a theatre of authority. The architecture itself, thresholds that narrowed, stairways that swallowed the light, chambers that could be sealed like a mouth, suggests an intimacy of control. Archaeologists have long remarked that some rooms were plainly public, and many others conspicuously restricted. Access was a statement as much as a right. When Themistocles Zammit first drew the plan of those subterranean corridors in the early 20th century, he recorded not only plaster and red ochre, but the careful choreography of entrances and barriers. Such design is the archaeology of power. Power in the Hypogeum wore many faces. It was communal and it was concentrated. Among the thousands of bones, estimates speak of some 7,000 bone fragments, representing perhaps 2,000 individuals, lay traces of an inner circle. A class of dead who received different kinds of treatment, particular placements, polished stone basins, the proximity of carved figurines. The sleeping lady, that enigmatic seated figure discovered in the deeper sanctum, is not merely an artwork. To the storyteller, she is a signpost. Here the sacred and the social meet. Around her, ochre-stained niches and finely made objects mark spaces that, by their care and restriction, signal privilege. Objects tell a tale of authority that extends beyond the island. Exotic materials, shells, not local, finely worked stone and pigments, appear in contexts, suggesting controlled distribution. Whoever managed the Hypogeum and its rites also managed movement and reception. Trade tokens and prestige goods become instruments of allegiance. Anthony Bonanno and other scholars have argued persuasively that in late Neolithic Malta, a few hands guided the exchange of value, turning rare items into the outward signs of inner power. In this light, the subterranean complex becomes a vault of social memory as much as a repository for the dead. The priests, if we may still call them that, were the custodians of technologies of persuasion. They possessed the rights of sound and silence, and in a place where a single voice could swell to something uncanny. Mastery over acoustics was political mastery. The deepest chambers amplify low frequencies. Modern acoustic tests reveal focused resonances that would make a whispered syllable bloom into a presence. Imagine a speaker's voice emerging from the sleeping stone, tremoring in a way that the living body could feel as much as hear. In such conditions, a pronouncement is less speech than transfiguration. Fidelity becomes holy. Obedience becomes testimony. Power also hides in the care of bones. The Hypogeum's curators rearranged, painted and stored skeletal remains. The archaeology shows re-entry and rearrangement, deliberate rather than chaotic deposition. Ancestor veneration is not mere sentiment here. It is social architecture. Those who curated the dead curated genealogy, memory, and thereby claims to continuity. To possess the relics of forebears, to cite them in ritual, or to press them into the service of a ceremony, is to anchor authority in lineage and in the sacral past. The inner circle could claim descent from named ancestors whose remains rested beneath the stone altar, and the public recognition of that descent was liturgy and law. Yet the title king is slippery in this island world. No stone inscription crowns a sovereign. No palace has been unearthed to declare a single, all-powerful monarch. Instead, power is fragmented, blended, priesthood and leadership braided together. Comparisons with contemporaneous Mediterranean polities offer analogies but not answers. Elsewhere, Crete, Cyprus, elites combined ritual, redistribution and visible spectacle. The Hypogeum's custodians did much the same, but within a subterranean register. Their court was a procession of darkness and echo rather than a sunlit hall of thrones. And so the enigma persists. The archaeology supplies names without faces, rooms that speak of hierarchy, artifacts that whisper of privilege, bones arranged as testament. We can point to the grooves on a basin, the traces of pigment on a skull, the placement of a figurine beside a niche, and read ritual and rank. We can also hear, in the vaults, the faint remnant of voice as if captured in stone. But who rose in the outer light and claimed the title of leader? Who tightened the ropes of authority in the inner chambers? The Hypogeum keeps these answers close, exchanging them only in echoes. The rulers of Malta's underworld are both visible and concealed. Visible in the careful archaeology of tombs and goods, concealed in the silence that fell when the doors were closed. Their power was cemented in ceremony, reaffirmed by sound and bone, and handed down like a song hummed beneath the earth. Even today, standing at the mouth of that ancient throat, one feels the residue of command, a summons that never quite becomes an answer. Salt and wind, and the sharp gull cry of the central Mediterranean, these were the currencies of influence long before coins and crowns. To the peoples who watched the Maltese horizon, the island was a jewel of limestone and harbour, a waypoint where currents met and ambitions collided. Above the buried sanctum, the Hypogeum lay mute and untouched by daylight. Above that, the shore teemed with strangers, traders and would-be masters whose footprints and pottery shards have been left like a map in the island's soil. The earliest rivulets of contact are not carved on monuments but traced in glassy, black flakes of obsidian, whose chemical signature points to Lipari and Pantelleria. Archaeologists have found such obsidian at Maltese Neolithic sites, Scorba among them, proof that Neolithic mariners were not isolated islanders but participants in a web of exchange stretching to Sicily and the Aeolian Isles. Pottery styles whisper the same tale, parallels with Stentonello, where in southern Sicily, and later affinities with Monte Claro, hint at long coastal conversations, traders bringing saltstone shell and ritual shapes, islanders reciprocating with honey livestock and the subtle currencies of prestige. By the Bronze Age, Malta's landscape shows the grammar of defense as well as trade. At Borkinadua, on a wind-scrubbed promontory, the remains of massive stone ramparts and megalithic towers tell of watchful eyes facing the sea. These fortifications are not the language of casual visitors but of communities preparing for raids, competition for grazing land, or the control of landing sites. Layers of pottery and hearths speak of occupation and sudden abandonment. The skeletal silence of some burials hints at upheaval rather than peaceful change. The island's smallness magnified every foreign ship that rounded its headlands. An amphora might mean new oil and wine, or it might be the forerunner of soldiers and taxes. The tide of history washed in strangers who wrote their names across Malta in new alphabets. By the first millennium BCE, Phoenician sailors, the seafaring merchants of Tyre and Sidon, saw Malta's harbours as convenient anchors on their westward routes. Tazilk, a multi-layered sanctuary near Marsaxlokk, bears their imprint. Excavations reveal Phoenician temples and votive deposits piled atop earlier sanctuaries, a palimpsest of devotion showing how incoming cults co-opted local sacral geographies. The Phoenicians exchanged trade goods, carnelian beads, decorated amphorae, but also ideas. And where ideas go, new loyalties and rivalries follow. Carthage, daughter of Tyre and mistress of Western Phoenician power, found Malta an important stepping stone in the contest for Mediterranean trade. Legends of Elissa Dido, fleeing Tyre and founding Carthage, are tales of migration and ambition mirrored in the material record when Carthaginian kilnins and Punic inscriptions appear in later strata. During the turbulent years of the Punic ascendancy, Malta's position between Sicily and Africa made it a prize and a danger. When Rome and Carthage clashed in the Second Punic War, the island's coasts changed hands. In 218 BCE, Rome took control, folding Malta into an empire whose ambitions would eclipse those of ancient traders. Yet not all threats arrived in organized campaigns. The archaeology records smaller violences, broken domestic wares, hurriedly sealed storerooms, and the transformation of sacred places into practical ones. Storerooms in caves, reinforced yards at coastal villages, even the reuse of older religious platforms for defensive outposts. These are the signatures of communities adapting to a world where trade brought both wealth and predation. What the Hypogeum witnessed from beneath the limestone is a story written on a different plane. While caravans and triremes negotiated for dominion over harbors and salt pans, the subterranean sanctum resisted easy capture by remaining secretive and sacrosanct. Its silence became protection, its inaccessibility a bulwark against the appetites of seafarers. Yet the rhythms of commerce changed the island above, and those changes in turn would alter how the living treated the dead. Phoenician altars rose near earlier shrines. Bronze Age towers looked seaward for threats. Through it all, the subterranean spaces, whether repositories, refuges, or sanctuaries, were touched indirectly by the ambitions of men who never saw their innermost recesses. So the Hypogeum remained, in a sense, both sheltered and threatened, sheltered by its darkness, threatened by the ceaseless demand of the sea. The fragments of amphory, obsidian glinting like distant stars, the ramparts of Bork Inador and the layered temples of Tozilk, these are the chorus of evidence that tells of Malta's long argument with the world. From the first Liparian blade to the clay of Punic merchants, the island stood at the crossroads, and the deep rooms below ground listened as every passing tide brought a rival at the shore. Listen close now, and let the lantern of memory gutter and glow, for beneath Malta's low sky a chorus of distant shores still answers. What we call the Hypogeum is not alone in its hush. Across the Mediterranean, through strata of soil and speech, sit echoing practices that bind rulers, gods and cults into a braided story. Here I will trace those threads, leader to priest, idol to oracle, stone voice to human ear, and listen for the tremor that crosses seas. Think first of authority that fused sacred and political. In the palaces of Bronze Age Crete, Knossos' frescoed rooms and ritual basins suggest a class of priestly rulers, not mere warlords but mediators with the divine. On the Greek mainland, Linear B tablets name the Wainax, the Mycenaean king, whose title recalls divine sanction. Far to the east, Hittite kings in Hattusa performed state rituals as guarantors of order. In Ugarit and the Levant, city kings shared theocratic roles with temple elites. Malta's own elite, whatever titles they bore, belonged to that Mediterranean family. Leaders whose power was as much channeled by ritual speech and ceremony as by material wealth. Across the water the faces of gods shift, but their functions echo. The mother goddess, so familiar in Maltese statuary and the rotund figurines found in Skorba and Tarxene, has cousins at Catalyuk, where plastered skulls and figurines speak of ancestor veneration. In Crete, the so-called snake goddess embodies domestic fertility and ritual rule. In Anatolia, the Great Mother, who had become Cybele, is both nurturer and imperial symbol. Centuries later, in the Eastern Nile, Osiris becomes the emblem of death's renewal, and with him comes a cult logic that binds living rulers to the fate of the dead. These are not identical images, but the same idea refracted, a central deity, often female, sustaining life, death, and social continuity. When cults met, they borrowed instruments of authority. The oracle at Delphi, where the Pythia gave utterances that shaped polis policy, is a late but vivid example of voice as governance. Ancient pilgrims reported trances and ascent from fishes. Priesthood regulated access and interpreted ambiguous speech. Alexander of Macedon's journey to the Siwa oasis to consult the oracle of Ammon is another note in this melody. A ruler seeking divine confirmation of sovereign status, granted by a temple's endorsement. These practices show how sacred spaces could manufacture legitimacy. The Hypogeum, with its controlled environment, could perform a similar function, a subterranean arena in which sound, ritual, and presence made authority tangible. There are also striking archaeological parallels in how communities treated the dead and the remembered. At Catalyuk, plastered skulls mounted on walls memorialized ancestors within domestic shrines. Mycenaean, Tholos tombs enclosed elites beneath monumental stone. Sardinia's nuragic towers and tombs of the giants turned death into conspicuous architecture. Malta's own subterranean mortuary architecture joins this lexicon of remembrance, a deliberate choreography of space and ritual that seals collective identity. The Hypogeum's use of repeated deposition and curated objects sits easily beside these traditions, an island practice reflecting broader Mediterranean logics of ancestorhood and social memory. Yet foreign cults introduce subtler correspondences. Minoan ritual scenery and Anatolian fertility rites emphasize cyclical rebirth. Mesopotamian and Levantian practices underscore intercession with chthonic gods. The mixing of these themes in Maltese contexts suggests not wholesale importation, but selective adaptation. Local leaders and cult specialists, adopting widely intelligible religious grammar to consolidate power. They borrowed motifs, the enveloping mother, the buried king, the oracle's voice, and shaped them to limestone and local seasp. And then there is sound itself, that sly language of subterranean power. Acoustic studies in modern times have shown low-frequency resonances in certain hypogeum chambers, a physical vocabulary, like the low drone of oracular centers elsewhere, capable of making human bodies and minds attentive. It is a tool, as potent as icon or inscription, by which leaders and priests across the region could command silence, induce awe, and claim communion with other realms. So listen for the echoes. Not exact copies, but parallel answers to the same human questions. Who speaks for the dead? Who binds the community? Which voice is heard as divine? From Knossos to Catalyuk, from Delphi to Hattusa, the Mediterranean was a theater in which rulers and cults improvised variants on one another's acts. Beneath Malta's limestone, those improvisations found a unique stage, but their script was written in a language understood across the sea. They left it slowly, as if permission were asked and granted in the dark. The last lights were carried up the stair, and out into a sky that had grown stranger to them. The last voices ceased to answer the cavern's low, patient hum. What archaeology now calls the end of the Hypogeum is not a single catastrophe, but a braided unmaking. Social shifts, new arrivals on the shores of Malta, the exhaustion of customs whose logic no longer fit a changing world. The stones remembered more than the living dared to name. Stratigraphy and radiocarbon whisper the chronology, the great subterranean chambers filled with the work of centuries, and then, between roughly 3600 and 2500 BCE, fell quiet. The bones tell a similar story. The skeletal assemblage, numbering in the thousands, speaks of collective rites, and then of a dwindling intimacy. In the uppermost fills of some chambers, archaeologists found layers that suggest deliberate closure, slabs tamped in place, passages choked with earth, surfaces walked over and left to the slow patience of dust. The very act of sealing became a final rite, an emphatic cut between the world of the living and the listening dark. Outside those sealed mouths, the island was changing. New shapes of pottery, slim beakers with distinct corded rims, begin to arrive on the stratigraphic tables. The beaker phenomenon, a wave of new burials and new ideas that swept the central Mediterranean around the 3rd millennium BCE, where once collective entombment and long memory had reigned. Individual graves and different mortuary economies began to assert themselves. The Hypogeum did not close because a single hand turned a key. It closed because the very grammar of belonging on Malta had shifted. Paleopathology and isotopic studies add shadowed color to this story. Skeletal markers showed changing diets, episodes of stress and recovery, periods when the islanders' food webs contracted and then transformed. Trade lanes shifted. Sicily and the wider Mediterranean offered other goods, other alliances. When exchange patterns realigned, the sacred architecture that had been sustained by certain social contracts lost its patrons. Leadership structures that had commanded collective burial rites may have dissolved. Their authority eroded as much by new pottery and people as by droughts and crop failures we glimpse in pollen core and soil chemistry. And yet abandonment is not an ending so much as the seedbed of story. Silence begets explanation, and explanation becomes myth. For generations after the shafts were filled, the memory of the subterranean place lived as rumor in the field names, in the halting directions of shepherds, in the wary caution of children told not to stray. When the Hypogeum was accidentally reopened in 1902, a modern disturbance that dragged the site into daylight, it was Sir Themistocles Temi, Zamet, and his small team who began to translate silence into catalogue, bringing to light not just bone and cup, but the sediment of stories. Their notebooks and photographs are themselves palimpsests, scientific record and the first lines of a new myth told to a modern audience. The birth of myth here is twofold. There are the local layers, whispered spectres of giants beneath rock, of subterranean priests who still spoke in echoes. Then there is the global reimagining, the Hypogeum recast in travelogues and exhibits as an oracular dark, a prehistoric cathedral of mystery, with resonances that delight the public imagination. Tourists stand where once only a few could enter, cameras replace lamps, and curators choose which silences to preserve and which to fill with interpretation. This act of selection is itself myth-making. It decides which questions are worthy and which answers are allowed. There are also deliberate, small betrayals of memory in the archaeology. A sealed chamber yields not just bone, but the residue of ritual, ochre stains, traces of oil, a scatter of beads which can be spun as evidence of sophisticated belief, or read more humbly as the detritus of evolving practice. The Hypogeum's final occupants left the last traces they could: a child's finger bone, a broken bead, the faint smudge of a palm. Those tiny marks became in later centuries the raw material for Persic stories that insist on meaning where practical collapse once reigned. So the Hypogeum passes into myth, not as a tidy legend, but as a layered archive of abandonment. The stones remember who buried whom. The bones record diets and migrations. The dust holds the fingerprints of last rites. Yet between those hard data and our hunger for narrative lies a fog. We can chart the when and the how, but the why, the interior reasoning of a community that chose to close its caves and let history walk on above, remains an enigma that will not be reduced to tidy prose. That mystery is the Hypogeum's true inheritance, a silence that keeps speaking, inviting every new ear to listen and to create the stories that carry the ancient dead into the present. Beneath the island's sunlit streets, the Hypogeum keeps its counsel, and the counsel, in our age of instruments and inquiry, is a contest between measurement and myth. Scientists enter with lasers and spectrometers. Pilgrims arrive with candles of the imagination. Between them, the underground temple holds its ground, preserving a human mystery that refuses to be fully translated into data. When UNESCO placed the Calciflini Hypogeum on the World Heritage List in 1980, the world acknowledged not only stone and skill, but a fragile atmosphere, a vault of air whose chemistry is as much a relic as the carved stone. That designation set the terms for a new stewardship. Heritage, Malta, and the Superintendents of Cultural Heritage adopted strict limits, visits reduced to small groups, timetables regulated, and the microclimate monitored night and day with arrays of hygrometers and CO2 sensors. The chamber that once heard rites now listens to instruments, temperature graphs, particle counters, and the quiet digital signatures of humidity rising and falling like a living breath. Archaeology, too, has learned humility in this place. Radiocarbon chronologies, refined across laboratories in Europe, have tightened the Hypogeum's timeline. Isotopic analyses of bone and tooth enamel hint at diets and mobility across the central Mediterranean, and non-invasive surveys, ground-penetrating radar and 3D laser, scanning map shadow and relief without scratching the ancient skin. These technologies have done what earlier excavators, guided by hands and trowels, could not. They have multiplied the voices of the past without disturbing the chorus. The University of Malta, in collaboration with international teams, has produced digital models so faithful to limestone grain and mortar seam that scholars can test acoustic simulations, light paths and airflow on a laptop rather than in the unforgiving dark. It is in acoustics that science and reverence often meet in tacit disagreement. The Hypogeum's reputation for uncanny resonance has become a magnet. Physicists bring spectrum analyzers and impulse response tests. Psychoacousticians record how low-frequency tones make the human body feel as if touched by an unseen hand. The sleeping chamber and adjacent recesses studded with modern microphones and finite element models reveal a deliberate manipulation of sound, niches and angles that amplify particular frequencies, producing standing waves and a sense of auditory focus that modern theaters try to emulate. Scientists can now show charts and sonograms. They can reproduce the hum in a lab, and yet that does not quiet the experience. Visitors who have heard even digital rendition speak of something more than data, an internal tuning, a sensation described by one acoustic researcher as a bone-deep empathy that resists full explanation. Tourism has been both boon and danger. The island depends on visitors who come for megaliths and Mediterranean light, and the Hypogeum is the siren in their map center. Authorities tightened access decades ago. Only a few dozen people a day may descend, both to preserve the ancient calcite and to protect the secret sonic ecology. To reconcile awe with preservation, virtual technologies have become sacramental. High-resolution photogrammetry, panoramic audio capture, and immersive virtual tours allow distant pilgrims to enter a faithful shadow world while the original remains quiet. These digital doubles have also fostered new kinds of devotion. Composers and sound artists, barred from performing inside, craftworks inspired by measured resonances, producing concert pieces and installations that echo Calzaflini's hum on New York stages and in Berlin galleries. The Hypogeum's voice travels, transformed, across oceans, and the living myths grow. Maltese storytellers still speak of the place as a mouth to the other world, a threshold where names are not so much remembered as invoked. Contemporary writers and filmmakers borrow its chiaroscuro, the stern, soft light, the subterranean hush. Pilgrims, not all archaeologists, light inner candles in their own imaginations, carrying back tales of inner madness and solace, of dreams that began in the limestone. Scholars like Sir Temi Zammit, who shepherded early investigations, are remembered both as meticulous cataloguers and as inadvertent midwives of legend. Their notebooks are now artifacts of how modernity first tried to translate silence. Science continues to be a patient lover of the Hypogeum. Geneticists wait for non-destructive methods to read ancient DNA from calcite envelopes. Acousticians refine models that might one day reveal whether certain sounds were used therapeutically or ritually. Conservationists test breathable consolidants to stop salt decay without sealing the stone's memory. Each method yields answers and new questions, and each answer ripples through the living myths that refuse to be wholly tamed. In the end, the Hypogeum's legacy is not a tidy ledger of facts. It is a covenant between those who measure and those who kneel, between a global community that documents and a local culture that remembers. The underground keeps its equilibrium, a place where science, sacred tourism, and song converge, and the world above continues to listen, to argue, and to believe.